Welcome to this event on the crisis in Myanmar, Repression, Resistance, Repercussions, brought to you by the Southeast Asia Program at Stanford's Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center in partnership with the Weiser Diplomacy Center and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Michigan. I'm John Ciorciari. I direct the Diplomacy Center and I'm a faculty affiliate at the Southeast Asian Studies Center at Michigan. And my co-host is Don Emmerson, who directs the Southeast Asia program at APARC. We're here to discuss the coup and the current crisis in Myanmar and to put it in context in its regional, geostrategic, historical, and domestic political and social contexts so that we can better understand the crisis and its implications. And we're joined by two expert panelists to shed light on the situation. Moe Thuzar is a fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, where she's managed and co-managed its Myanmar Studies program, served as a lead researcher in its ASEAN Studies Center, and helped it engage with Myanmar during the country's preparations to chair ASEAN in 2014. She's also been a Fox International Fellow at Yale while working on her PhD at the National University of Singapore. She previously worked for a decade at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, heading its Human Development Unit, and she's widely published on Myanmar, on ASEAN, and international politics in Asia more broadly. She'll draw from her scholarly expertise as well as her extensive on-the-ground knowledge and personal experience of Myanmar. We're also joined by David Steinberg, Distinguished Professor of Asian Studies Emeritus at Georgetown, where he directed its Asian Studies program. Professor Steinberg has served as president of the Mansfield Center for Pacific Affairs and also has held U.S. foreign policy posts related to Southeast Asia as a member of the Senior Foreign Service. He's also represented the Asia Foundation in Burma, in South Korea, in Hong Kong, and in Washington. He's the author of 15 books or monographs and countless articles, many of them on Myanmar, and he'll draw on his decades of both scholarship and practical policy experience in the country. After our panelists speak, we'll have some time for discussion. Ambassador Scot Marciel, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar from 2016 to 2020 and is now a visiting scholar at APARC, has kindly agreed to attend this event and contribute to the conversation. And so now I'll turn to my co-host, Don Emmerson, to provide a few very brief introductory remarks of a more substantive nature for today's event. Among other things, Don is the editor of a new volume very relevant to our conversation. It's called The Deer and the Dragon, Southeast Asia and China in the 21st Century, a volume to which David and I contributed and which Moe assures us is there on her desk. So Don, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you so much. What I want to do is operate a little briefly here on two levels. The level closest to the activity that's going on the ground, but then a much higher level involving outside powers. So in other words, the domestic situation on the one hand, and some sense of the international situation insofar as it bears upon the domestic situation inside Myanmar at the moment. And I'm not going to get into a lot of speculations, but I would like to perhaps underline a few I'm sorry, probably very, very obvious questions. Within Myanmar, it seems to me that analytically, the question who will win, I suppose if you look at who has the guns, then it's clear that the Tatmadaw, that is the military, that is the junta, will win. But it has been remarkable to notice the, not just enthusiasm, but the beyond belief, courage and bravery of the protesters organizing this movement, which is still going on as we meet. And there, it seems to me, the interesting question is this: is it conceivable that although it seems to me the Tatmadaw will always maintain superiority when it comes to coercive force and weaponry, I think that's fair to say, is it possible, and Moe, for example, I think can talk about this and others, is it possible that there will be a shifting kind of concatenation of elements, if not forces, inside Myanmar, including particularly the ethnic groups that frankly have been in one way or another at war with the regime going all the way back to what, 1948, 49. I mean, this is the country that as I understand it, has the longest running civil disobedience, if you will, civil disobedience, really civil war, fragmented to be sure, perhaps longest of any country in the world. David can correct me on that point. And so is it possible that rather than pitting the young urban sort of Democrats with a small d who really want to go back to the situation before the 1st of February, before this all began, is it conceivable that there could be allies, that there could be strength involving the commitment and participation of other elements inside the society of Myanmar, which would clearly strengthen the opposition to the regime? So that seems to me to be a crucial question, rather than simply saying from the outset that, of course, the junta will win because they've got the bullets, right? So that's the first thing I would say with regard to the domestic situation. Moving quickly on to the situation in other countries, obviously the question is this. There is already speculation, as I'm sure many of those who are attending this webinar will realize if you followed it in the news, that Myanmar could become the next Syria. That would be horrible. That is a civil war which is egged on and rendered even more bloody by the involvement of outside powers, neighboring powers in particular. Now, I think we're quite some distance from that, but here it is particularly important, it seems to me, to focus on the role of China and what China is thinking about what's going on in Myanmar. And here it seems to me we want to avoid a kind of stereotypical sort of knee-jerk sense of, well, on the one hand, well, you know, China's an authoritarian regime and therefore they must back the junta, right? On the other hand, one can say, well, China wants stability, beyond anything else, more important than democracy. And because they want stability, then they may figure that, well, you know, the junta is not behaving in a way that contributes to stability in Myanmar. So I think it would be useful to explore that kind of, you know, choice of interpretations with regard to China and what China may be doing. And then, of course, beyond that, we get the international organizations, we get the United Nations, we get ASEAN. ASEAN, of course, is the most proximate of all these international organizations, and in some ways, therefore, can I suppose you could say, can run the risk of greatest embarrassment. Already, some have called ASEAN a club of dictators. But ASEAN in this context is, I suppose you could say, if the junta is invited to an ASEAN meeting, there should be a foreign ministers meeting. Well, actually, it's a summit coming up, right? Originally scheduled for April. My understanding is it has perhaps been postponed until May, perhaps because of the embarrassment of ASEAN in inviting the junta and therefore associating with the junta and behaving as if they were providing refuge for the junta, supporting the junta, which would really damage its reputation even more than it already has been damaged by the sense in which ASEAN is irrelevant, that it was never meant to have a foreign policy. And now that it needs a foreign policy, its structure, particularly the ASEAN way, which requires a kind of unanimity, is going to essentially cripple it and prevent it from doing anything constructive with regard to Myanmar. And then last but not least, of course, US policy. We will get into that, I'm sure, and certainly when Scot Marciel talks, even though, remember, he is the ex-ambassador, so he doesn't want to say anything necessarily that would box in the current ambassador. Nevertheless, it will be interesting to hear from him as to the choices for US policy going forward. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Don, and let's get right on with our panelists and start with Moe.
In the time I have, I'd like to talk about what's happening in Myanmar in the present context. Who are the people? What are the prospects of any leverage that either ASEAN or its important international interlocutors, including the US, China, and others, can have to help Myanmar stabilize? And in doing so, I'll try to touch on some parallels from the past, but not too much, because the person from whom I have learned most about Myanmar's past and present parallels is going to speak right after me. I'm just a warm-up act. But, well, facetiousness aside, because Myanmar right now is currently spiraling into instability, I think there is this real, very clear and present danger that threatens regional stability. And it is imperative that we try to look at how we can all help in our different ways from where we're sitting, and our different strengths and expertise, how we can help to not let it spiral downwards again. And all of this, I think for me, it's bringing up a sense of déjà vu, but it's also, there's this new or renewed sense of urgency and desperation that the Myanmar people are feeling for the country's future. Past military coups were effected in the name of restoring law and order after a situation of perceived chaos. And the military has been accused in the past of causing or provoking some of that chaos. But the situation of chaos and confusion in 2021 was after the coup, created primarily by the military junta against peaceful and unarmed protesters. And this situation continues more than 2 months after February the 1st. And our civil war looms closer, as Professor Emmerson has also highlighted in the opening comments. In earlier talks, I had alluded to the current political and social crisis in Myanmar, with escalating bloodshed as a war of attrition, with the junta set on crushing all opposition to its unlawful takeover. And researchers studying state terror and how it is imposed or entrenched will tell you that this is a usual practice of the military in Myanmar. For example, Dr. Nick Cheeseman of the Australian National University, at a webinar talk I recently moderated, has observed brutality is a reminder of embarrassment that all states are capable of brute force, but in a country like Myanmar, where there is a violent specializing military acting with impunity, not just because people are being shot dead, but because of effective use of frontal or spectacular violence. And again, Professor Emmerson has reminded us, this state terror never really went away. The frontier wars, the civil strife that has been fought with ethnic armed organizations almost from the time of independence. And most recently in our memories, of course, the disproportionate use of force in Rakhine State against Rohingya communities, causing an exodus to Bangladesh. But back to the present situation. To date, close to 700 people have been murdered since the first shootings on February the 9th, which have escalated with increasing deadly intent since February the 20th. Over 2,000 have been detained. Key NLD, National League for Democracy leaders, have been charged with breaking import, export, and natural disaster laws, and more recently charged with corruption and under the Official Secrets Act. So even the military's calculated gesture of releasing over 600 detained protesters on 24th of March needs to be viewed in the context of the use of lethal force in a, to quote Amnesty International's report on 11th March, a planned, premeditated, and coordinated manner. There are continued killings across towns and cities in Myanmar, even when the military was commemorating Armed Forces Day over the weekend of 27th and 28th March. And there have been purposeful targeting of certain suburbs and satellite towns in major urban centers such as Yangon, Mandalay, Myitkyina in Kachin State, the town of Monua in central Myanmar, and recently the whole city of Bago, just 2 hours drive away from Yangon, using disproportionate force. And yet the spirit of the protesters, mostly a leaderless movement fired by the inspiration of Generation Z youth, supported by people from all walks of life and various generations, continues undaunted. And so too does the Civil Disobedience Movement, or CDM, which started on February the 3rd with medical workers and preceded the protests, which were actually, people started actually going out on the streets in Mandalay first on February the 4th, and Yangon followed later. And here I am reminded in 1988, doctors and medical workers were also at the forefront of providing assistance to injured students, some of whom were already under arrest at the time. And so the CDM, the Civil Disobedience Movement, is being nominated for consideration by the Nobel Peace Prize, but that apart, it has gained ground across sectors, especially in ministries and departments that are integral to the country's economic life. The junta's underestimation of and subsequent anger at the CDM's potential to harm the daily tasks of bureaucracy, and by extension, the junta's promise for business continuity and better governance when it took over unlawfully, has occasioned the vice chair of the junta, the State Administration Council, as they style themselves, to sarcastically call the CDM country destructive movement, as even military personnel and earlier on, members of the police now count among defectors to the CDM side. So the start of the CDM as we know it today, as I mentioned, dates back to February the 3rd, when 70 medical workers stopped work amidst COVID-19 vaccination efforts that were starting. And to date, many across the country have joined the CDM, and several have been arrested for their participation in it. or dismissed or suspended from their jobs. Most are from the mid to lower ranks of the civil servants. I think the only high-level, high-profile CDM instance would be Ambassador Moe Thuzar, Myanmar's ambassador to the United Nations in New York. And Ambassador Moe's defection, if I could use the word, or I would rather say denunciation of the junta, was on February the 26th, when the military nullified the 2020 election results. And starting in February 2001, hundreds of staff, including at the director level in the ministries of commerce, electricity, energy, transport and communications, agriculture, livestock and irrigation, have all joined the CDM in the capital, Naypyidaw. Some 40 or so Myanmar diplomats have also declared their support for the CDM, but interestingly, none from the Myanmar mission in the United Nations, apart from Ambassador Moe Thuzar. And public support for the CDM via the daily protests across the country continues to grow, despite these threats, arrests, and dismissals to set an example. In early March, over 50 staff, ranging from mid-level officers to drivers, in the Ministry of Planning, Finance, and Industry were temporarily suspended. Also, over 100, close to 200 employees of the Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank were dismissed. 85 staff, mostly entry-level officers or attachés in the Myanmar Foreign Service, were also dismissed for the same reason. But a government sector that was the hardest hit by the CDM is transportation, affecting the military supply and logistics chain, as well as the whole logistics and connectivity of Myanmar's economy. Staff from Myanmar Railways in both Yangon and Mandalay combined constitute over 90% of railway employees on strike, according to an official from Myanmar Railways. And some of these staff have been evicted from their staff quarters for participating in CDM, but they continue to be defiant. And the latest purges are some 80 officers from the Ministry of Foreign Investment, and also 10 university rectors and 47 deputy rectors under the Ministry of Education. And all this is happening amidst curfews, nighttime harassments, and raids. So the Gen Z protesters and the CDM are also supporting the actions of the committee representing the Piranzu Suto, or the CRPH, which was first formed on February the 8th as an interim entity representing the elected members of parliament and, by extension, the National League for Democracy government. The CRPH has expressed its support for the CDM movement and has also announced that punishment was awaiting those civil servants not joining the CDM while serving as the SAC's collaborators. Literally in Burmese, the term means handles, tools. The CRPH is also serving as the main interlocutor for dialogue and discussion with the ethnic organizations, including the armed groups across Myanmar and with the international community through people like Dr. Sasa, the special envoy to the United Nations, U Tin Lin Aung, who is in charge of international relations and I believe is in the United States, and U Moe Thuzar, who continues to serve as the sole representative of the elected NLD government to the United Nations in New York. But the CRPH is, however, limited in the options it has available to contest the foreign policy or the external relations space in areas where the State Administration Council currently dominates. And so with each kidnapping, torture, killing perpetrated by the military, there is a narrowing space for CRPH to explore the kind of pragmatic and peaceful solutions on the behalf of the Myanmar people. So the junta recently announced a unilateral ceasefire as an overture to the ethnic armed organizations. But that did not include a similar undertaking to stop shooting protesters. And the larger ethnic armed organizations, such as the Kachin Independence Army and the Karen National Union, remain engaged in fighting the Myanmar armed forces and have also offered basic military training to the young protesters. So the situation of Syria in Southeast Asia that Professor Emmerson has brought up is, I think, something unthinkable for the people of Myanmar. But they are digging in for the long run to do away once and for all with prolonged cycles of military dictatorship. So in such a situation, for me, as a constructivist, mediation becomes imperative. But what kind of mediation? What precedents exist for a workable process that consults all stakeholders, all the key people involved in Myanmar's political and social crisis, and who or what entity should coordinate this complex process. And it seems, for all its shortcomings, ASEAN is the default platform and entity, mainly because Myanmar is an ASEAN member. And the situation, as I mentioned earlier, now poses a clear threat to regional stability. The instability in Myanmar poses a clear threat to regional stability. And of course, it falls upon also on ASEAN's shoulders to try and bridge any mutual suspicions among major and rising powers, such as the US and China, and also to maybe perhaps jolt or persuade other countries in Asia. For example, Japan, preoccupied with business continuity and currently the Olympics. India, concerned mainly with counterinsurgency and countering China. But ASEAN, as a collective whole, also faces the challenge of bridging divergent interests of individual member states regarding how to engage the recalcitrant regime in Naypyidaw. Because ASEAN views not engaging as not an option for ASEAN, even as experts call it alibi diplomacy, to be seen as doing something. So how does this resonate with the key actors? On the one hand, the CRPH understands the importance of having constructive dialogue with ASEAN. It recognizes ASEAN's important role in helping Myanmar and the people return to a situation of stability and start the journey of rebuilding and recovering from this very serious setback, politically, economically, socially. Then, does it have the space? The State Administration Council views ASEAN as a convenient platform through which to assert its legitimacy, indeed. SAC representatives are participating in and attending various business as usual routine ASEAN meetings that have continued on the virtual platform since the COVID-19 lockdowns and travel restrictions. Even Senior General Min Aung Hlaing did not pass up the opportunity to get his word in at the ASEAN Chiefs of Defense meeting in March, chaired by Singapore. So while they are government officials from various governments around the region and the wider international community who are carrying out informal conversations with the CRPH. But the CRPH representatives cannot raise their concerns in an official capacity and setting equal to the SAC. And so now we are in this situation where there is agreement yet to be reached on the dates of the ASEAN summit, what should be on the discussion agenda, and so what can ASEAN feasibly do? But then again, having worked on both sides of the table regarding ASEAN cooperation, I think we cannot ask ASEAN to be what it is not. That is, to borrow from a senior Singapore diplomat's observation, we cannot expect a cow to be a horse. So what can we do with these limited options for ASEAN to talk to the SAC to be part of the solution for Myanmar? Any solution cannot hope for a return to pre-February the 1st conditions. The current crisis, the rare political and social awakening that transcends class, politics, ethnicity, and religion across the country, and the senseless bloodshed that continues in the face of opposition to yet another military junta have all made sure that there is no stepping back into the same current. So at the multilateral level, I think it is important for the individual ASEAN countries to continue advocating for Myanmar within the organization, as well as much as possible at international forums, such as the United Nations, because ASEAN is particularly relevant and central to Myanmar in the military's legitimacy calculations. And the founding members, the leading members of ASEAN, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and yes, even Thailand under a military junta that sought to learn from Myanmar's disciplined, flourishing democracy, they all have an interest in Myanmar's political, economic, and social stability. And of course, I think we understand only too well that suspending Myanmar's membership might be detrimental to the association's regional interests. The ASEAN Charter does not provide for such a step yet, and it may cause even more divergent views among the ASEAN member states. So we need to be mindful of ASEAN's regional interests, but it is precisely because of ASEAN's regional interests that we need to have ASEAN's role more visibly in returning Myanmar to stability from this current political and social crisis. So it has, the instability in Myanmar has already set back ASEAN's regional integration, never mind regional stability. And also this is particularly felt in the economic sphere. So I think It's also useful, I think, to explore the possibility of maybe an ASEAN UN meeting, as was the case during the 2008 Cyclone Nargis experience. There was a tripartite mechanism between ASEAN, the United Nations, and the then government of Myanmar, which actually showed new ways of bringing about change for the better in Myanmar. So there are creative ways and means to promote ASEAN's substantive central role. And this is something that Professor Emmerson has also talked about in The Deer and the Dragon. There is a substantive role of centrality that ASEAN can play, as opposed to the convener role that many people seem to attribute ASEAN centrality to in coordinating an international response on Myanmar. And of course, ASEAN doesn't follow the practice of sanctions, but examining ways and means of limiting economic interactions, which may be required under some of the targeted sanctions imposed by countries like, say, the United States, the UK, the European Union, and others, or in connection with entities that are related to or proxies of the junta, I think can send an equally effective message. And something to note here, Myanmar is currently the rotational country coordinator for ASEAN-China dialogue for the term 2021 to 2024. Now, may I ask, what kind of meaningful dialogue can there be when the country coordinator is in disarray and cannot manage consensus within its own jurisdiction? China's own economic business interests in Myanmar are at stake here, and these concerns may outweigh the interest that China has always held to bring Myanmar completely into its orbit. The longstanding distrust of China's intentions while continuing bilateral engagements under the Baokpo or sibling rhetoric. Now, in Myanmar, this had seemed to give way somewhat to a more pragmatic economic and investment-related calculations under the National League for Democracy government's inaugural term. And this was despite many respondents to my institute's annual survey, the State of Southeast Asia, where the findings on Myanmar were that more people in Myanmar participating in the survey were expressing more skepticism than optimism of China's Belt and Road moves, despite a realistic acceptance about China's expansionist moves in the region, and also less trust in China doing the right thing in global governance. But still, China did recently make contact with the CRPH and has also openly stated its interest to assisting ASEAN's work in whatever mediation effort that could help to change the dynamic. But as of now, we haven't seen any discernible effects of all of this so far. So to conclude, ideally ASEAN as the main coordinator or honest broker, if you will, for the wider international community's interests to assist Myanmar's recovery, could possibly start the process of a pause to the bloodshed in the name of humanitarian assistance for the country's social crisis. And this could possibly gain an entry point for a new kind of shuttle diplomacy, bringing expertise, but also like bridging the different key stakeholders in Myanmar, as well as the divergent positions and domestic politics of the other ASEAN member states. It's a tall order. But ultimately, this might lead to the projected general election being convened under coordinated auspices of, say, ASEAN and the United Nations, ensuring fair representation and inclusion across race, ethnicity, and religion and politics. But for that to happen, the junta needs to acknowledge that something is rotten and the provenance of that rot. I'll stop here for a while.
We'll turn to David to share some comments, and I'm sure those will include some thoughts as well on the historical context as well as the geostrategic context between China and the United States. So, Professor Steinberg, please.
Thank you. I'm going to step back. And what I'm going to say is not to justify anything the military has done now or in the past, but really to look at how influential it has been, and therefore how difficult the future is likely to be. In Burma, Myanmar, the military has ruled or influenced more than any other country in Asia and perhaps in the world. Since 1962, it has controlled the country. This is the fourth coup. This isn't the first. The first coup was in 1958. It was a consensual coup, they called it, because the civilian government agreed to it. The military would take over for a specified period. The 1962 coup was, according to the military, to save the union of the country. That, I think, was false analysis, but that was the justification. The 1988 coup was to store up a military regime that had collapsed. And of course, we now have the fourth coup, the 2021 coup. During this period, the military ruled and influenced by a number of ways. One, by rule by decree. In other words, they just controlled everything. That's from 58 to 1960, 1962 to 74, 1988 to 2010, and now since February 1st. They've also done this through political parties they created and controlled. The Burma Socialist Program Party and the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the one that got defeated so badly in the November 2020 election. But it did it through a third means, which is still one of the major problems. It did through it a constitution it wrote and approved in a manipulated referendum. And that constitution gave the military a stronger role than in most countries in the world which didn't titularly control the country. What it did, it was determined, I believe, by the military by 1962 that they would stay in power indefinitely. They did this because the Burma Socialist Program Party of the 1962 coup, no one could resign legally. It was all military. No one could resign until General Ne Win resigned in July 1988. They controlled all the coercive forces in the state. In 1958, they didn't control the police. They did since then. They control right now under the Constitution the ministries of defense, home affairs and border affairs, and home affairs includes the police and intelligence. It used to include the civil service, but that was taken out. It includes the autonomy of the military. In other words, if you have a titular civilian government, Aung San Suu Kyi, she cannot control the military. That is autonomy. And they have inside that constitution 25% active duty military. They have control of the National Defense and Security Council. They have 3 ministries. And in the Constitution, it is written that the military is an active force in politics. This, of course, I think was the Indonesia model. But why was the military able to remain in power? And that is quite different. Not only did they have control of all the coercive elements in the state, but they did something no other society was able to do. And that is they controlled all the avenues of social mobility in that society. Economics was socialism. The state owned it. Politics, we had a single party authoritarian state. Education was controlled. All information was censored. Information coming in, leaving the country. And so you had an insulation there that the military tried to maintain. They really couldn't, but it was important. They also, of course, appealed to the standard elements of political legitimacy in the society, Buddhism being an absolutely critical one, and nationalism and the elimination of the control of the economy by first the British, the Indians, and the Chinese. These were all important elements of their political legitimacy. The question now is, why this fourth coup? Because the elements I have indicated that the military had control institutionally of all the elements of power in society. Why did they need another coup? Even if they lost the election so badly, that didn't mean that they lost the power within the Constitution to do what they were doing. And then we get into power, or the questions of speculation, of course. And I would argue there are two things. One is leadership issue. And remember that leaders in Myanmar, Burma, historically, loyalty is to the leader. The loyalty is not to the institution the leader is in charge of. What has happened is Min Aung Hlaing, one says from secondary sources, wanted to be the president. He could not be the president because his party, the BSPP, I'm sorry, the USDP party lost so badly, it didn't have enough seats to augment the military's 25%. Plus any splinter parties they hope might develop. That might give a chance for Min Aung Hlaing to be president. He could be vice president, because one of the military will always be vice president under that constitution. So there was this antagonism. There's a very, very strong sense of ego on both sides. Aung San Suu Kyi, father of George Washington, whose father was George Washington, if you will, and Min Aung Hlaing, who is pictured as a future king in the Burmese tradition. That's one element they could not get along. The other element is this, and this again is completely speculative, and that is humiliation of the military. Now, when the comedians satirized the military under the junta during the 90s, these guys got arrested. But nobody except a few newspaper people knew about this. Now, when the military gets humiliated, everybody knows in 10 minutes. The country knows, the world knows, the humiliation is deep. And the military, in spite of all the cruelty and the bad action that we've seen historically, the Rohingya, today, there are people there who feel, in the military, who feel that they are being patriotic. They have a misconception, I think, of what it means to be patriotic. But I do think that some of the people at least believe that. And they see this humiliation as being a terribly, terribly destructive force. And so those are the reasons, perhaps, for the coup that took place, because it took place on February 1st. The new Pluto was supposed to meet then and form a new government on April 1st, which is April 1st being the start of the fiscal year in Myanmar as well. So this humiliation, I think, was exceedingly important. But the military did not stop what the press usually says is moving towards democracy. It was moving towards representative, multi-party government, yes. But the problem is it was a military defined, as Moe said, a disciplined, flourishing democracy. And every time you put an adjective before the word democracy, you screw it up, essentially. You limit it. And this is what has happened. What we had really was a diarchy, a military-controlled elements of government and some civilian elements of government, but the civilians that were supposedly in charge could not affect the military. So we have a different situation. In 1958, the military said, put us in charge for 6 months and then we'll have a fair election and give you back to civilian government. It took them 18 months. They did have a fair election and the military-backed party lost. But then, of course, the military stepped in 2 years later with the coup. So there's a pattern here, but the pattern will not work because what you have, as Moe pointed out, you have a Generation Z. You've got information immediately available to everyone. And you've got the interests of internationally, this means that the government cannot do what it wants to do. And I am afraid, if you look at the situation in the future, as Don said, the military has the guns, they can stop things for a while. But as you've seen in the past, that a non-political event can form enormous demonstrations of anti-military attitude. We've seen that in '88. We've seen it at U Thant's funeral. We've seen it in the Saffron Revolution, so-called. There are periods when people just will not put up with this anymore. And so even if the military is able to come up with something, it is not likely to last forever. The military will be under great stress. Now, this whole pattern is based upon the idea of the unity of the military. I do know that there have some former military disapprove of the coup. But certainly, according to all reports, the military commanders all approved of it in advance, hours before the coup took place. So the military may split. That would cause a completely different situation. And as you point out, the international relations are going to be terribly important. The United States will probably impose even more sanctions, but the sanctions are limited. They will not have the effect of regime change, which is what our previous sanctions under the junta were for in the 1990s. And China, as indicated, will want some form of stability. As Aung San Suu Kyi said, good relations with China are, quote, commonsensical, which is absolutely true. Chinese influence is very, very strong, but there's a strong anti-Chinese feeling as well. There is a large amount disputed, but we're talking millions or more, illegal Chinese immigration into the country that controls a lot of the retail trade, not only the big projects of the Belt and Road that we all know about. So this is another factor that is, and it's apparent in the literature as well. So China is concerned about this. It will try and smooth things over so it can have its way. Japan is caught in the middle. And as we talked about ASEAN, we can discuss that more. But we are in a situation which would lead to instability internally, more chaos. I hope not Syria. But I think a lot more deaths and a lot more destruction.
Thanks, David.
It's up there.
Thank you very much, David, for that. And that actually provides a very nice segue into our welcoming Ambassador Scot Marciel. And Ambassador Marciel, welcome to the conversation. And we look forward to hearing a few comments that you may have and a question or two, if you'd like, for the panel.
Thanks very much. To me, I would just highlight a couple of points. One, I think this coup and the aftermath has broken the Myanmar mold. As both of them said, there's no going back to the status quo ante. I can't imagine it. And for a couple of reasons. One is the military's coup and its subsequent brutality has just infuriated the whole country. And I just don't think the public is going to accept, certainly not easily accept, anything that allows the military to rule or to have the sort of power it had before. But second, and very importantly, it's brought about, to a certain extent, a long overdue generational shift. And a lot of the people behind the protests and civil disobedience movement are a younger generation who have had a significant taste of freedom. And that's part of the reason they're fighting so hard against this coup. As I said, there is no going back. On the other hand, of course, the Tatmadaw is not exactly known for introspection and compromise. So the default right now is for things to get worse, for neither side to give in, and for there to be more violence, further economic decline, more refugees, greater instability. I'm not a big fan of the Syria analogy. I think it's useful in terms of reminding people of the humanitarian horrors that await Myanmar. but I think there's a lot of things that are dramatically different from Syria. So the question is, what can the international community do? And the international community, as you know, is divided between those largely in the West and some others who are appalled by what's happening and want to take strong action to put pressure on the military. And there are others, I don't think there's a lot who are big fans of the military coup. I don't have any reason to believe China is thrilled about this, but there is a lot of countries, too many countries, that sort of, let's just hope this gets better mode, which is a really bad way of looking at it, but nonetheless, that's where a lot of governments are. It's not going to get better on its own, I don't think. So I agree with Moe Thuzar that we'll all look to ASEAN, not because ASEAN has amazing strategic and diplomatic heft, but because it does have the best chance of opening a door. And I agree also that possibly looking back at the 2008 ASEAN UN cooperation in Cyclone Nargis, that opened some doors. The thing is, what should ASEAN do? And I hear some in ASEAN talking about some kind of humanitarian mission to try to just calm things down. Obviously, any kind of mission that could calm things down and reduce military violence would be useful. The risk, though, particularly with an organization like ASEAN, is that would quickly develop into acceptance of the status quo and of the SAC, which would be, I think, a huge mistake and counterproductive, and also would be widely opposed by the Myanmar population. So I think my question is, for the panelists, is there a way, given that neither the military nor the population as a whole is looking for mediation right now, for the most part, is there a way for ASEAN to at least lead an effort, it doesn't have to be all ASEAN, that could involve getting people on the ground who could end or at least greatly reduce the military's violence without de facto sort of accepting the status quo in terms of the military rule?
Thanks very much for that question, Ambassador Marciel. Moe, would you like to take a first response of that?
This is really interesting because I share your concern that ASEAN's position or view currently held that, as I mentioned, not engaging is not an option, does present, again, that double-edged sword, because early on in the protests, there were a lot of very quick, immediate reactions to, say, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno's attempts at shuttle diplomacy, where people learned later that she had been in conversation with the CRPH, but that was not public information. So what the optics that people in Myanmar and indeed the world were seeing was Ibu Retno trying to engineer these meetings, and the junta's foreign minister flying out to Thailand to have this huddle in Bangkok and so on. And so I think those optics did have repercussions domestically in that, why is ASEAN according legitimacy to this brutal regime that is shooting people in the streets and denying democracy? And I think that lingers. It also expanded to protesters making very targeted statements outside several embassies representing the different governments of ASEAN, especially countries that had business interests, for example, like Singapore. So there were all these, I think, also cultural elements pushing in about boycotting this product, that product, although never as vocal as, I think, boycott Chinese products or questioning placards outside the Chinese embassy about the imports of seafood, with allusion to those flights that came in from Kunming for technical assistance. So this kind of, I think, the legitimacy and control. I mean, I think I talked about this earlier on in another conversation about. It seems both sides, if you look at it, and of course, when I say sides, there are many interest actors and players. But if we're looking at the CRPH, on the one hand, representing the popular sentiments and supporting the protest movements and the CDM, and the junta on the other side. In both ways, they are looking for legitimacy and control, and there are different means employed. On the junta side, as Prof. Steinberg has highlighted, as you have highlighted, Ambassador Marciel, it's the use of terror, it's the use of the constitution or whatever laws that exist as somehow some kind of justification. And negotiations and mediation seem far from the junta's mind. For them, they are the representatives, and they are the so-called legitimate entity, whereas the CRPH is also trying to assert its legitimacy as the group, the entity that represents the truly elected people's representatives, and so on. This is what I was probably trying to highlight more in talking about the international relations space becoming important. So here, I think engagement with Myanmar and these different actors and stakeholders by members of ASEAN and the international community really need to also show that kind of nuance, that they are in conversation and that due consideration, due consultation is given to the CRPH whenever a move is made, so that anything that is going to be tabled at, say, an ASEAN meeting on Myanmar really needs to have that prior consultation, not just with the SAC, but also with the CRPH, to have that buy-in. And only, I think, having that kind of consensus, if you will, the broader consensus, then the discussion, I think, on ways forward, steps forward can pragmatically continue. But that's also assuming that ASEAN is speaking with one voice on this. It's not. So again, I don't want to sound facetious, but is it a chicken and egg kind of situation? Whose consensus internally do we seek first? Because the 9 other ASEAN member countries have very different domestic politics and interests that are playing into all of this. And as you know, there are some countries that are dragging their feet more than others. So I think that's the challenge that ASEAN faces in tackling this issue of consensus over creative ways of intervention. Myanmar has been, the recipient of many efforts of good-willed interference, if you will, in the past. And the 2008 Nargis experiment seems to have proved the most successful so far. And that's where the justification of regional stability comes in. Maybe that's a strong argument that can be used. Look, the country is spiraling into instability. You have all these multiple ethnic armed groups now engaging in combat with you, and you're spreading your resources thin. So maybe that's why they declared a ceasefire. But with all of this, when your country implodes, and I know that people like Richard Horsey from the Crisis Group has already kind of hinted at, stated that it is on its way. Myanmar is on its way to becoming a failed state. So with that kind of potential threat looming about the country collapsing, at what cost are you going to try to push forward your legitimacy? This is to the SAC. At what cost? When you may probably not have a country to preside over, and this would be worse than, say, the Yangon government in the 1950s. So I think it's those kinds of arguments about how one country's stability can affect the whole regional stability argument that should be probably, I think, on the minds of ASEAN interlocutors when they discuss among themselves on the repercussions for them individually, domestically, particularly neighboring countries which have borne the brunt of the exodus on the east side of the country, not just the west side, when it came to people fleeing conflict and fighting. So it's a bit of a rambling answer, but I think I'll stop there and probably hear Prof. Steinberg's advice as well.
Let me make a point here that the record in Myanmar of foreign mediation consultation has been very bad. Every time somebody came in to look at the Rohingya problem or other kinds of problems, foreigner, no, we don't want foreigners doing this. This is our stuff. It's not any foreign interest. The second issue is a complex one about legitimacy. There's a balance, and you have it's a balance that each one has to decide for themselves. It's by simply talking to a regime, you give them some legitimacy. But can you change that regime through such talking? And if so, how much? And this is basically a very difficult, almost personal kind of evaluation. And you're right, if it's just simply to support the military, that it would be a very bad thing. At the same time, dialogue with the military is important. The United States did something years ago very useful. During the junta period, EU withdrew all their military attachés. The US did not. And there was somebody there to talk to the military. Now, whether you like it or not, there is a camaraderie among the military worldwide. I mean, good military, bad, but different from lawyers, doctors, accountants, academics, that is stronger, and that gives hope that maybe somebody will listen. Now, all this is very speculative, and I throw this out because to illustrate how complex the issues are.
Any further thoughts in response to that?
Maybe I could just jump in quickly because there is a movement supporting the CRPH in terms of providing funding support. And there are, I think, consultations going on with legal advisors and all that. As I alluded to, Prof. Emmerson, there are also these informal level conversations and discussions that various representatives of governments around the region and the world are engaging with the CRPH representatives in. So that kind of parallel approach is there. And I think the main important point here is that whenever any action is going to be taken either at the international level or the ASEAN level, the CRPH's views and inputs would need to be sought and squared away. I think speaking more in the ASEAN context, this is even more important because ASEAN seems to be the default interlocutor. Mainly, probably this is due to the situation around the globe where countries are, let's face the facts, more concerned about getting over the COVID-19 vaccination hurdles and getting their own domestic economies back on track after all the setbacks that COVID-19 has caused globally. And so this is the kind of I think situation that Myanmar finds itself in right now. The people of Myanmar, I should say, because they are very they are always competing points for attention, whether domestically or whether they are crises in other parts of the world that also distract international policymakers' attentions. So I think in this type of undesirable situation, with all its shortcomings, as I mentioned, ASEAN seems to be that default interlocutor, mainly because they have admitted Myanmar into their fold, and therefore they have to kind of like be the people communicating with these unsavory elements currently sitting in the seat of power. But the challenge there, of course, is also to what extent does this confer legitimacy, which is what the junta seeks first and foremost, and which it is trying to entrench via the ASEAN mechanism. And that's, I think, maybe the image line, the credibility line that ASEAN has always had to walk when it comes to dealing with Myanmar, with a brief blip in the past over maybe 2016, 2020. What was I going to say here? I think the challenge also is that on the SAC's side, their comfort, if I'm to borrow Prof. Steinberg's observation from earlier ago, their comfort in this kind of interlocution or engagement seems to have that preference for ASEAN. So that's one thing. So it needs to be very delicately calibrated. And the added sense of urgency to do this, I mean, for me, for where I'm sitting from, is because, yes, with all the limitations that the scope of the ASEAN chair and even now the office of the ASEAN Secretary General carries, right now, according to the rotational chairmanship, it's Brunei. Right. And what comes after what comes after B? It's C. It's Cambodia.
Right.
So
right.
I think, having Brunei's having to deal with this under Brunei's chairmanship, with this maybe very coordinated inputs and consultations from the from the founding leading members of ASEAN that I mentioned, and yes, trying to bring Thailand on board. To that informal coalition, if you will, of this group within the grouping, is imperative for this year, because, like I said, the rotational chairmanship does not work in our favor.
Can I jump in real quick on this? I want to just stress that for me, this is just my personal view. I've tried to reason with these generals. It's impossible. They live in a different universe. I don't think there's a mediated deal to be had, to be perfectly honest. Certainly not one that the people of Myanmar would accept. And I've argued privately with some good friends in ASEAN who I have a lot of respect for, who basically called for some kind of mediation that leads to another election. The trouble is, if there's another election, as long as the SAC is administratively in control, forget about it. It's going to be a joke. So I'm not at all optimistic about that. I think the point I was trying to make is, if ASEAN's going to have this summit, they need to try to do something. If they can find a way, and some of them are talking about a humanitarian mission. And so I'm thinking rather short term here, if some kind of humanitarian mission that, of course, the SAC would have to agree to, ideally gets some ASEAN officials on the ground, and maybe that helps stop or at least greatly reduce what's going on, which is a military campaign of trying to terrorize its own population into submission. It doesn't solve the big problem. I don't know how you solve that. But that would be potentially useful, as long as ASEAN can do it in a way that, by being there and then they're on the ground and they're talking regularly with the SAC representatives, and next thing you know, it's like, well, this isn't so bad. So I think that's the challenge, and for Moe Thuzar's point, this is where it has to be paired with really careful dialogue with the CRPH. And again, this is just for some initial step to try to stop the terror campaign.
I completely agree, Ambassador Marciel. It's the thin end of the wedge, but how that thin end of the wedge gets further traction is the delicate challenge that we all face. And, that's what ASEAN faces.
There's a question from Tom Finger at Stanford about whether the position of allowing or encouraging ASEAN to lead could be, in essence, a crutch for others not to be as meaningfully engaged here and to sit back and, in a sense, a buck passing problem. And if a weak corporate actor like ASEAN is the one holding the buck, is that a problem? How concerned are you about that possible dynamic?
I agree completely with Tom. I think that's absolutely right. And it leads to the following proposal. Why couldn't a couple of democratic countries, Japan, Australia, the United Kingdom, France, the US, get together and form some kind of a committee that would operate independently to see what could be done to restore the original democracy, or the democracy in progress, to be sure, in Myanmar?
Yeah, look, I'm going to be careful here, because I'm very mindful that a lot of people at the State Department and NSC are working on this, and I'm not privy to those conversations, so I don't know where they are on this. I'm with you in spirit completely, Don. The question is, what usefully could such a grouping do that would actually have any influence inside the country, particularly on the SAC's behavior? But I think that the two are not mutually exclusive. I mean, you can have such a, like the old Friends of Myanmar grouping or something that could be focused on one aspect. While, I mean, I think any ASEAN effort would have to be working very closely with the UN Secretary General and the Special Envoy, and should have the support of other actors. It shouldn't be an ASEAN only thing. I think ASEAN's role, just like in 2008, can be maybe, putting as Kun Soren used to say, put an ASEAN face on something.
Yes, I agree with Ambassador Marciel. That was the honest broker role I was referring to, and that was Dr. Surin's words, I think, that ASEAN served as an honest broker, helping to bridge the international community sympathetic to the cause of Myanmar. And I think the situation in 2021 is very clear. International support is not for the SAC. It's for the people of Myanmar and the CRPH that is representing the government as the interim entity. But how to get that response, how to coalesce assistance to Myanmar, I think that's where that bridging role, the honest broker role of ASEAN comes in this, again, maybe revived Friends of Myanmar around the UN SecGen, and hopefully also bringing in the ASEAN SecGen to do what it can. He's already the coordinator for, I think, humanitarian assistance in the context of the Rohingya repatriation. So that's another kind of on-the-ground mechanism that Myanmar and ASEAN were trying to negotiate under the NLD government's first administration.
So far we've been focusing mostly on how the international community can be useful with regard to what's happening inside of Myanmar. But we have a few questions in the queue here about how the international community should prepare for what happens to the residents of Myanmar who flee and are outside of the country. Is ASEAN and our other neighbors prepared to handle the possible scale of refugee exodus? And we have one question more specifically about the United States. What can concerned members of the community here in the US do to help the United States prepare for possible refugee exodus?
That's a good question. I don't think Thailand will, be used to exploit people in terms of workers coming from Myanmar. India will be very cautious, taking some, but that area is, of course, a non-Burman area. It's the Chin area, and that creates a different set of issues. The U.S. ought to do something. I agree. And some of the other countries ought to do something as well. And certainly the Biden administration would be theoretically more prone to this than the Trump administration. So I think somebody ought to push that. I think our representatives in Congress ought to be pushed to do something in that regard.
Right. I mean, the way this would work, of course, would be that as refugees leave, mostly to Thailand, maybe some to Bangladesh, some to India. Obviously, those governments would have to accept them. And I think the international community needs to be working with those governments. I assume those conversations are happening. I don't know for a fact, but I assume those conversations are happening. And what the US and other members of the international community have done in the past and presumably would do would be to provide substantial funding so that the countries that receive these refugees don't have the major financial burden of dealing with them. And that's normally, look at the Rohingya in Bangladesh, where we've been by far the largest donor. And so it's not that the refugees would leave and come immediately to the US or some other country. There's a long pipeline of people from around the world waiting in lines of refugees to come to the US. But to get the funding, to give the incentive funding and some, friendly diplomatic pressure on the neighboring countries to accept refugees. I'm assuming these conversations are happening.
I want to shift gears a little bit for a few other questions that are asking about the dynamics inside of Myanmar. And one question is about whether the various armed ethnic groups in the country could in fact unify in opposition to the Tatmadaw and in support of the opposition, and how that would most likely affect dynamics. And I'll link that to another question, which is, if the dynamic is escalatory and conflict intensifies, whether Myanmar could be the site of a proxy war that draws external powers into competition for influence in the country?
I'll take a quick stab at it because I think this is where the role of the CRPH is really crucial in trying to get as broad a consensus among the ethnic groups and especially the armed organizations that they are in varying degrees of discussion with. Earlier on, after the coup, there was a group of ethnic armed organizations that were involved in the peace talks, who were in, I think, a joint ceasefire monitoring committee in discussion with members of the military. They stopped those discussions. They stopped participating in those discussions and withdrew themselves. And recently, we've seen announcements from various ethnic armed organizations expressing support. Of note is the Northern Brotherhood Alliance, which includes the Arakan Army and a couple of the ethnic armed organizations that are operating along Myanmar's eastern border with China and with parts of China. So while the Arakan Army, the leader of the Arakan Army has come out to say that they're not going to allow CDM in Rakhine, that they have announced their own way of Rakhita, of looking after their people and so on. In principle, he is sympathetic to the cause of what's going on with the protests against the military junta. Now, with the other members of that alliance movement stating it, and I think some of the perceived proximity that they have to China, I think this is where the concern comes in about China's role in all of this. But, you know, I've been reading all these military or defense-related updates and leaks, and the Myanmar military is still buying drones from countries like China and Russia. So really, I think that's a kind of really fluid situation we're seeing right now. And of course, the bigger armed groups that have always held very strong views of their own political autonomy and situations, such as the Kachin Independence Army and the armed wing of the Karen National Union. I mean, they continue to be fighting the military, and they are good at on-the-ground combat. But I'm not so sure whether when drones are employed, they're currently equipped to do so, or they might start seeking their own retaliatory measures via technology.
I just briefly touch on the proxy war idea. I mean, it's one of those situations where you never say never. It doesn't strike me as likely for a whole host of reasons. Again, this is not Syria. It's a very different situation. I don't see that. I think a lot of countries outside of Myanmar don't like this instability and have an interest in a return to stability. But I have a hard time, again, with all the usual caveats, I have a hard time seeing this turn into a proxy war. I hope I'm right.
We've got just a few more minutes left. I want to ask one more question, and we'll have a chance for a brief response to this. It brings us back to domestic politics, and it's one of many great questions we have on the chat. Sorry that we can't get to them all. This one's from Meredith Weiss at SUNY Albany, and she's asking essentially, is there evidence that the junta has a plan to govern, to provide social services, to administer the bureaucracy, notwithstanding all of the dissent that Moe mentioned in her remarks? Or does the plan in the near term simply be to exercise coercive control? And I'll tack on a sort of a question of my own to that, which is, if indeed that the junta is mainly focused on the narrower aim of asserting control, is that sustainable in Myanmar?
My quick answer is, I think the junta was thinking more short-term than long-term. So I think they really believed in their narrative that they were going to present a better business friendly and better governance alternative to the NLD's lackluster performance over its first term. But they completely underestimated or did not calculate the impact of the civil disobedience movement. Even though the participating numbers seem to be lower, and from the lower, like mid to lower level ranks, these are the paper pushers, the pen pushers, the people who actually move the bureaucracy. And so the impact of the civil disobedience movement has been felt, is being felt, hence the threats and coercions and the sackings and the dismissals as examples, and the very, I think the use of the power and control that they have, that the junta has, to force people to return to work. I mean, those are the dynamics that are going on. So I would say they completely underestimated the impact of the CDM and the support that it's getting. And because they did not have longer term plans beyond, I think, sincerely believing in their own rhetoric that they would be able to push through those 6-point plans, including convening elections. Yeah, I think that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think it's a short-term deal. I don't think they have considered, but they say we're going to have a free election in a year. That's not impossible now.
No, it's 2 years.
If it's 2 years, but it's short-term. They're not thinking about the social services. They're not thinking about anything except what they regard as law and order, which means suppression. I think that's unfortunately the situation. They will use the term law and order over and over again, but we must understand that that is not the way we understand the use.
And I think that just illustrates, what's so different about 2021. They're still sticking to their old playbook and going back to it, but the whole protest movement has moved on.
Right.
And they're still sticking to the NLD as their nemesis and trying to focus on basically making the NLD irrelevant. But again, the country has moved on. This is much more than the NLD. This is really a shared sentiment that crosses a lot of lines, that transcends a lot of lines.
We've come to the end of our 90 minutes, and we thank you all in the audience for joining. Of course, we're very grateful to our panelists and I to my co-host, Don Emmerson, also to Ambassador Marciel for joining us. Come back for more programming at Stanford and Shorenstein APARC, as well as at the Weiser Diplomacy Center and Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Michigan. Thank you all.